As the old adage goes, you shouldn't judge a man until you've walked a mile in his shoes. And not just any man could fill the shoes once worn by Glenn Irvin White Jr. from Logan, West Virginia. During World War II, the then 19-year-old Sergeant Glenn Irving, or G.I. White, as his crew called him, was a tail gunner who served aboard a B-24 Liberator bomber that flew 26 missions deep into the heart of territories held by Germany's Third Reich. In December of 1944, Glenn's plane was shot down over Innsbruck, Austria, forcing Sergeant White's crew to abandon the aircraft among raining enemy fire. In an unplanned act of foresight, Glenn made sure that his boots, or GI shoes as they were known, were tied to his parachute harness before setting on the edge of the escape hatch, taking a deep breath, and rolling down into the sky, onward into an adventure worthy of its own action film. Sergeant White had never made an emergency exit from a plane, so he did his very best to remain calm and made a rough but successful landing outside of Udine, a small Italian village bordering Austria. Much to his surprise, he was greeted almost immediately by locals, who gladly took his parachute off his hands and offered him aid in the form of rough peasant clothing, which he donned along with his GI shoes, after abandoning his flight suit and boots. Armed only with his .45 caliber service pistol and a pair of long john underwear for warmth, Sergeant White began a cat-and-mouse game of hiding from German forces, aided by local partisans and villagers, and traveling back towards the safety of Allied territory. That first night in Udine, sheltered inside a fodder shock in a field, White wondered what his fate would be as the temperature dropped and the sky darkened. He was filled with such uncertainty, not knowing if this day would be his last. He knew that the German troops would be searching for his crew, knowing their numbers from counting the amount of parachutes as they fell from the plane. White's life was entirely at the mercy of strangers. After several days, Sergeant White began helping around the village in order to keep his mind occupied and off the uncertainty of his situation. While working outdoors, Glenn spotted a detachment of German troops heading his way and frantically tried to hide, knowing that his GI shoes would give him away as an American soldier. After coming upon a gardening villager and imploring him for help, he found that this villager not only knew English, but was willing to aid him in evading capture. The man, a former West Virginia coal miner, cautioned him to play dumb and forget his English if the Germans were to come to the house searching. He instructed Glenn that if questioned, to repeat after him no matter what. This advice became life-saving when several days later, German soldiers came to the house in search of him, and asked both men if they had seen any Americans. Following the man's lead, White answered, "Nein Amerikanen," and the soldiers were fooled into abandoning their search of the home, moving on to look elsewhere. This close call put into action the next phase of White's journey back to his allies. That evening, White found safe passage to Yugoslavia hiding under the hay of a horse-drawn cart driven by a group of brave Italian partisans. The partisans tried to relieve Glenn of his service pistol, but Glenn refused to give it to them, even at their urging that they were taking him to meet up with his crew. Fortunately, fate would have it that they were telling the truth, and Glenn and several members of his crew were soon reunited. Fearful of detection, Glenn's crew had to hide outdoors in the mountains, returning to the shelter of an alpine cabin only at night. Even this was not enough to evade detection. After several days, the Italian partisans were followed back to the cabin by a German tracker, whom they took hostage and later stripped of his clothing, shot, and killed. After the partisans found civilian clothing for the rest of White's crew, they began their journey across enemy lines, most of them in ill-fitting footwear. But not Sergeant White, who had on his trusty GI shoes. After several days of travel, White became ill with dysentery and was sheltered by a kind family who cared for him throughout his illness, sharing with him their meager food and offering him a warm bed. Upon his recovery, White met up with a different group of partisans who, along with some other fleeing American soldiers, resumed his odyssey across German lines through the bitterly cold and vastly hazardous Italian Alps towards the Italian coast. One evening, after wading naked through a frozen river, carrying their clothes and shoes above their heads, the men began to drink vodka in order to get warm, leading them to feel somewhat euphoric. White himself even broke into song.
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler? If You think we're on the run?
Unfortunately, this moment of jubilation led to detection by a group of nearby German soldiers. After being fired upon and running for their lives, Glenn's group narrowly escaped capture by the Germans. After several more weeks of strenuous travel and the barest of provisions, the soldiers finally reached the coast of the Adriatic Sea, where they were able to obtain passage on a fishing boat which, at last, carried Glenn and his companions back to the safety of Allied territory. In the approximately 3 months it took G.I. White to make his journey from Udine to Bari, he lost 35 pounds, leaving him weighing a scant 81 pounds upon his return to his countrymen. He had battled a life-threatening bout of dysentery, fought off hypothermia, suffered from body lice and exhaustion, dodged enemy fire, evaded capture, and against all odds, narrowly escaped being one of the 73,500 World War II veterans who were still counted as being missing in action today, all while wearing that fateful pair of GI shoes. For his military service, Glenn I. White, Jr. was awarded a Purple Heart, a Good Conduct Air Medal, and a European Theater Medal, among many other distinctions. He has since worn many different shoes, the shoes of a husband, a father, a grandfather, a teacher, and finally, that of a minister.